Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Welcome back to part 2 of the Development Finance Deep Dive. If you haven't already listened to part 1, then please go back and listen to that first. Therefore, this one will make a whole lot more sense to you. If you're back and you've listened to episode 1 already, then welcome back. Let's dive straight in. We've seen examples of projects that this has happened where people have had fixed contractors on fixed price contracts, and then the contractors have spent more money than they'd anticipated and things have come up, and then there hasn't been enough money left within the contract to do the work, and they've needed to carry those costs, and then it's caused stalled issues on site, and then people walking off site and stalled sites and development. So it is a very real thing, and especially I know some of the bigger developers in South Wales, particularly, they were caught on projects where they had fixed price contracts coming over through COVID, and because of the increase in costs, obviously with the shortage of supplies and labour and everything else, a couple of those companies ended up going bust. And now those are the contractors rather than the developers, but that leaves a headache for the developer at the same time. So yeah, just something that really needs to be managed accurately and carefully.
Yeah, and lenders obviously like fixed price contracts because they're very defined in nature. But there are risks also with those. That's not sort of a silver bullet and fixes all the problems. The contractor's taking the risk more so than you as the developer. I would argue then your due diligence needs to be stronger on the contractor to make sure they have the available funds for those eventualities. So just because you've got a fixed price contract doesn't mean that solves all the problems. It's just the due diligence needs to be, I would argue, more robust at the front end, making sure that they've accurately priced it as well. That's another thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks for that. So we've covered off quite a bit around the loan. One question I just did have, which is this loan setup is on the basis that planning permission is in place. Is that right?
Correct.
And if so, how does development finance work? So let's say I wanted to buy a property or a site that doesn't have planning permission, but my intention is to do something with it via the planning process. How do I get funds? How does that work? How do I get a loan or development finance for a site that doesn't have planning?
Yeah, great question. And it's something that we get presented to us on many occasions. Firstly, I think we need to understand planning and what is actually required on your project. Some things are done within permitted developments. Whilst I appreciate permitted development is an easier route to get the approval, it's still planning and you still have to go through a process. So we speak to many clients who go, I'm just going to do that through PD, permitted developments. And it's like, well, okay, but there's still a process. It still can be rejected. I appreciate the 56 days. There are tactics that council use to try and manage that process and the volume and so on and so forth. So it's not a given that you're going to get it, even if it is PD. So that's something to be mindful of as well. And I think many people assume or attribute planning to sort of house building. There are many instances where just converting a property or changing the use of a property, adding a bedroom, converting an attic, putting an extension on it, or even changing it from a 4-bed detached single dwelling into a HMO may require some sort of planning. So just be really mindful that you understand exactly what is required. You can't just change that property and have that. So that being said, how do you fund them? So you basically have to take a step back, pretty much. The lender can only lend on the knowns. So the only thing we know, let's assume this property we're buying is a 4-bed detached house that has not got planning permission to be utilised as a HMO. Okay. We can't lend on the basis it's going to be a HMO because the idea is that it might be a HMO. So the lender isn't then going to go and value it as a HMO, and then subsequently you can't use it as one, and then they've gone on lent and so on and so forth. So we have to borrow initially on the known, which is ultimately it's just a single detached house, 4-bed, and it'll be valued as such. So you would take a bridging facility, simple bridging facility to acquire it. Once your planning consent comes in, we would then look to convert or change that bridging facility into some sort of development facility. So how we tackle that is we take two scenarios with the client. Is option A, which is it's a 4-bed detached house. That's the value, that's the loan you can have. And then if you get planning permission, what is the outcome going to be? What are the development costs of doing that, and so on and so forth. Now, if we know that is definitely the proposed outcome, then we can ask the valuer to work on that basis. I caveat that with there is a risk to that, is the planning may not come through as you've gone and got the property valued. Therefore, we may have to go back in and amend it and update at additional costs. So ultimately, you as the buyer are taking that planning risk, and it's going to cost more because you're having to do things twice, maybe 3 times if that planning comes back different to what you anticipated.
And then that was option A, and what was option B?
Sorry, yeah. So option A would be taken. So we would firstly go on what we know, which is buying the asset, the property, just as a 4-bed detached house. What we would then do is map out the option B, which is the conversion of the HMO. So we would work on the assumption that you'd get planning as proposed, and then run the numbers on that. So you'd have effectively a bridge loan and a development loan quote, and then the valuer would work on both scenarios. As I say, but the danger is there that scenario B doesn't materialize as you think, and therefore you have to go back into planning, change it, the valuation will have to change then, and so on and so forth.
Great, thank you. So ultimately, the fact is you can purchase something that doesn't have planning, and your intention is that you can get planning on it, but all of the risk lies with you on a bridging loan in this instance, with your intention to then get planning permission. I know the conversation that we've had with a number of clients are, yes, you can do it, and we can help with that, of course, but all of the risk lies with you. And so we would always push back and say, well, what can you do? What can you agree with the vendor in order to try and minimize that risk? Because what you don't want to do, and this is certainly something we are very mindful of, is we don't want to get you a bridging loan on a property that you then can't get out of, or it's going to be expensive, or it's difficult to get out of. So what we would push back to clients is say, look, you want to transfer this property into a 4-bed detached in this example, and you want to turn it into a 6 or 7-bed HMO. You're pretty confident of getting planning. Well, why don't you do an exchange with delayed completion or a conditional exchange? So say, yes, Mr. Seller, I will buy this property off you. However, I only really want to buy it if I can get planning on it. So we'll agree the price now, we'll exchange contracts, but I'm only going to complete on the basis that I get the planning permission. So you don't actually buy the property, and but you're committing to buying it on the basis the planning goes through. So your risk is hugely minimized by saying, here's the planning app. You pay the planning costs, you pay the architect's fees and any other fees that you need to do in order to get planning. And then once the planning goes through, then you go through and your exchange is valid, and then you go through and complete on that purchase. And you can negotiate the timeframes on that to delayed completion as well, because you're not necessarily going to want to complete on the day that the planning application is approved. And the point being that all of this stuff is negotiable. Your terms are negotiable with the vendor, your terms it's basically a blank sheet of paper and whatever you can agree. So if you're looking to buy a property, you want to make the terms as favorable to yourself, obviously, as possible. But you're just trying to create a win-win ultimately, because then both parties are happy. From a vendor's point of view, they might say, well, I don't really want to go down that route. And if they've got lots of willing buyers, then they may not take that option, and you might be forced back to option A and B. But if they don't have a lot, if the property's been on the market or it's off market, and you're direct with the vendor and you can have these conversations, then option C is a really, really valuable way of reducing your risk.
Absolutely. We have had a few scenarios actually quite recently where clients are going to auction to buy properties, and what they intend on doing with the property requires a planning consideration. How long that would take, whether it's in a PD or what have you. Those types of properties, you're going to have to buy on the assumption that you don't have the planning. Whenever we do go down that road where you have to buy, there is no ability to, do anything which delays the completion or anything like that. Is ultimately to understand what is your exit strategy on the property as per the way you bought it. So if it is a 4-bed detached house and you subsequently don't get the planning permission and you've bought it, then what is the exit strategy? Is that going to be refinanced into a standard buy to let? Is it going to be a serviced accommodation? Are you going to sell it? And so on. I think the piece of advice that I would give is many people who see that there is an uplift in value because of something you're about to do will inflate the purchase price because they can see the value that you're potentially going to add. Don't get caught into a trap of adding that value if you haven't already got it. I mean, that's your value to create, right? But we do see this with landowners going, you can build 20 houses on here, it's going to be worth 5 million quid or whatever. So they'll inflate the purchase price because they can see the opportunity for the developer. Try not to get caught into that trap because that ultimately erodes your margin. And as we all know, these things never quite go to plan. And from the seller's perspective, this is nice and easy, you're going to make a X few pounds. Is a lot of work to get you to that outcome.
Absolutely. And we've heard a few horror stories from a planning consultant that we work with where people have just gone at auction and bought something for cash without doing any due diligence on whether they can get planning or not. They go, yeah, I can get planning on that. And the answer is they'll never get planning on it. And so that leaves them with a property that now they can't get rid of. They probably paid over the odds for on the basis that they're going to be able to add value to it, and now they can't. So we're going to, without detracting too far down into the planning route, let's bring it back to the development finance. But it's really interesting to know, because I know that's a question that we get asked commonly around, what if I want to buy something with planning? And a conversation that we have quite a bit. So just to kind of move things on then, we've talked about the structure of the loan to cost versus the loan to the end value, the GDV, and drawdowns and the importance of a QS, etc. So what about the cost of funds? What does that look like? What generally are, and I know this is quite an open question, what's it going to cost me, and what fees are involved, and how does the interest element work?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, before I go into that, just real quick, a quick plug on our part is if you are looking for schedule of works calculators and those sorts of things, we've on our website, if people want to go and check that out, primeproperty.finance, we've got a calculators button in the menu. That'll take you to an area where you can create a free account. And within there, we've got a multitude of different models and calculators that you can just play around with. You can't break them. One in particular, one that's in there that is pertinent to this conversation is around mapping out your schedule of works. And once you've mapped that, we've automated the cash flow process. So really easy to use. Have a play around with it. You can't break it. And as I say, it's all free. So just a quick plug on our part from that point. So just wanted to get that one in there from that as well. So back to interest and fees. What typically can we expect on that? So it does vary lender to lender. It'll vary project to project as well. I tend to say when we're working these things out to map it out at about 1.1% a month, 1.2, something like that. Now, there will be some of your larger developers that will say that's really expensive, and rightly so. They can probably get it for 6 or 7% per annum. But typically, if you're in the smaller specialist development funding world, then those are the sorts of rates that you can expect to pay. Arrangement fees, typically 2% of the gross loan amount. Okay. Exit fees, you can see exit fees. They're less common now than they were. Sometimes what you may see is rather than charge a 2% upfront fee, they'll charge a 1% upfront and a 1% exit. What that means is you get slightly more money on the front end and they charge you a bit more on the redemption. Obviously, you're looking for cash at the front end, so that can work quite well. One warning to avoid, to keep an eye out for on the exit is that lenders usually charge 1% of gross loan. I have seen 1% of GDV So 1% of the end value as an exit, which translates, as you can imagine, to 3 or 4% of the gross loan, depending on your margin. So if you see that, move away, go and find another
Run away
lender.
quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Run for the hills. I've only seen it twice in all the deals that I've done. Yeah, and we've never followed through with that lender.
Good point.
Yeah. So, but yeah. So on the pricing side, expensive compared to what? I guess is the question. What are you comparing these costs to? This is not a mortgage. Mortgages are designed for assets or properties that are finished, that you're not going to do any work to it, and it's a long-term facility. Bridging, in its sense, is a little bit cheaper because, as we said, you're just lending on a defined. We already know the outcome theoretically of that. Development, there are far more variables and far more risk. All lending, irrespective of what it is priced on risk. So how much risk is perceived will determine the cost of that money. That could be personal borrowing, your credit profile, and so on and so forth. So it's risk related. So development finance is the higher risk type of lending that's
And I think you made, I know people, like you said, at 1.1, 1.2, we're talking, 12 and a half up to sort of 14% interest per annum, which may seem a lot. And what people will push back with and say, well, I can fund that cheaper myself. I can find private finance that might lend me the money at anywhere from 8 to 12%. And I am going to jump through all the hoops. Well, the point being that you want to jump through those hoops. Those hoops are there for a reason. And actually, those are risk-based hoops, aren't they? So when a lender's pushing you through those hoops to jump through, all they're doing is mitigating risk. And if you're doing it in cash, the chances are you're not jumping through those hoops and not mitigating that risk. So it's going to come back and bite you at some point because you haven't accounted for certain things. You maybe have not considered all the warranties that you need, or you might not consider all the insurances that you need, or it could be a myriad of different things. But it's just really important to understand the reasons why they're making you jump through the hoops, is so that actually you can get out of the loan at the end, and so you can exit, so you can sell these properties or refinance them. Otherwise, they might come and catch you down the line. So that's just a really important point to note on using development finance instead of cash, I guess.
Yeah. And on that point, so you may be using cash. In all probability, you're either going to keep it and want a mortgage, or you're going to sell it and the person buying it's going to need a mortgage. Now, in order for it to be considered mortgageable, it has to have certain things attached to it. So given the level of works, if it's a new build, it will have to have the warranties. If you don't get the sign off through the process, those warranties may not be available, or certainly will be a lot more expensive because the risk is greater to issue the warranty if they haven't inspected the build all the way through, building control sign off and all of those sorts of things. Ultimately, it will end up with debt against it in one way, shape or form if you're selling it and so on. So what you don't want is to do all that work with your cash, realize it's unmortgageable, and it's going to end up back at auction, basically, where somebody's going to try and have to fix that problem themselves. So yeah, just be aware of that.
Okay, thank you. And in regards to then the structure of the interest, how does that work?
On the development loan, so best way to think of this is two separate facilities, okay? So we've already established that you ring fence, or you have your development, your refurb pot, if you like, and then you will have your purchase pot, okay? So the way we split it earlier in the conversation was we allocate the spend to the refurb, and then whatever's left gets attributed to the purchase, yeah? So the best way to consider this, two different pots. On the purchase side, you've had all of that money on day one, okay? And we do something called a retained interest model. So let's, for the purposes of this conversation, say it's 1% a month, because the maths is a lot easier. So we're saying 12%. So they would retain 12% because it's assumed you're going to have that money for 12 months. That's the term, or if you did a 9 months, etc. So 12% will be deducted from that on day one. Okay, so you don't actually get the 70,000 that we were discussing. You will have the interest deducted, and you will get the net advance. Okay, now that's done. That's defined. We know that you've got the money on day one. That pot is already accounted for. Of the different side of it, which is the refurbishment element, that pot, we do not know what's going to happen with that, because even though you've told us what your drawdown profile is going to look like, it could be faster, slower, etc., etc. You might get further into the bill before you need the money and so on. So that attributes interest on a roll-up basis. Okay, roll-up means that if you aren't paying anything whilst you're not using it. Okay, I draw 10,000. I now start accruing interest at the monthly rate or the daily rate. Going forward, then I'll draw another, and it'll just carry on rolling up. So my 45 or 50,000 pounds in this scenario will likely be 55,000 by the time I actually pay it back. So the quicker you can get through that exercise, the better. Or well, often actually, the more that you can spend of your own money without drawing the actual refurb element, the cheaper it ultimately is, because you're not using that money for a longer period of time. And that's how it is. So whenever you get a set of terms from us or any developer lender, these will always be indicative terms. Okay. The reason being is we do not know what that roll-up element is actually going to look like until the loan is formally drawn. Okay. I was talking to someone actually who was a development lender, and they made a really interesting point. Nobody knows the cost of a project until the end. You can forecast it as much as you want, and you can take your terms and you can plug those in, but you never truly know the margin until you've done whatever it is you want to do, and then retrospectively analyze it. So yeah, that was an interesting point. So that's how it works, and then the exit will be charged on all of the money accrued. So they'll work out the gross loan in advance. So that's how that works.
I think it goes back to the point you made earlier. That lenders will lend on the knowns, and so on day one they know exactly what the lender, how much you're borrowing. In which case they'll charge you the interest on that, but they'll say what interest will be, but they won't charge you that interest until it's known what you've drawn down further down the line. And you might be in a case like in this example, you would have bought the property, you've used the 70,000 loan to buy it, but you might have come into some other money, some other 50,000 from elsewhere that you might have had in, and you might use that money to develop the property and not use the development finance, in which case they're not going to charge you any interest for that. Okay, understood. So they charge you upfront they retain interest upfront on the money that you use to purchase, and then they charge you and roll it up and add it on to what you borrowed from them for the refurb, and then you pay it all back at the end. Yeah,
correct. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So, and obviously you touched a little bit on why development finance is more expensive.
Yeah,
obviously because it's risk based. Is there anything else that lenders other reasons or risks that are faced with developments?
Yeah, so one of the things we haven't talked about really in the risk profile of this type of lending. So again, we take a bridge loan, 4-bed house, you're not doing anything with it. We know it's worth £200,000 and it's going to be worth that. Even if something bad happens in the economy, it's not going to go down in value by £100,000 and so on and so forth. Or it's exceptionally unlikely that that's going to happen. If you think about it logically, on certainly a house, an existing property. So let's take our 4-bed house, for example, and we're going to turn it into a 6-bed HMO, right? There is going to be some reconfiguration that's going to need to happen. You might need to put an extension on and so on. That 4-bed house is likely to have its internals ripped out, various bits and pieces. It's no longer worth the purchase price. You've devalued the property by getting it ready to do the works that you need to do. So it'll follow that J curve. So I tend to refer to it as that Nike tick. Yeah. So it'll start at 0.1. It'll quickly depreciate in value by a figure, because you're obviously getting you have to ruin it before you can make it better. And therefore you'll see that value drop. Now, the risk to the lender here is that you've ripped it all out. You haven't got the money that you said you had. You've run out of cash, and the property is a shell of what it was that they originally bought. Clearly, there's going to be a problem there, and somebody's going to lose money off the back of that. So there is a risk point to it. Obviously, there's a point in that as it goes up where it passes its existing value, and then the risk becomes less and less and less. But in the first instance, you will see that as a risk. Now, one of the things that lenders, or one of the conversations we have a lot with clients is, especially if they can do the work themselves. So we speak about a lot of people who are in the construction industry who've got tons of experience of building houses or doing this type of work. They've gone off on a great project. They know they can do the work probably for half the price of if they went and put it out to a formal contractor. And then their margin is such they can get away with probably a smaller end value because their profit exists in the fact they're the ones doing the work. And I get it. That makes perfect sense. That is perfectly logical. However, and there's always a but, with this, the lender won't necessarily recognize that discount. Okay. The reason being comes back to, if you have to step away from that project, let's say you're the builder and you've done your backing, yeah, and you can't actually go back now and finish the project, and these things happen, life happens, right? So the issue here is that the lender now isn't going to pick that up as a half-finished project and sell it. They're going to step in, and I come to something called step-in rights, but they're going to come in and they're going to want to finish that project. Now, they aren't going to have the discount that you're going to have as the builder. They're going to have to go and pay a third party to come in, finish the project, get it to a point where it's saleable. So they will have to budget in that margin. So just something to bear in mind along the back of that as well. We do see these realistic figures in terms of I'm going to do the work myself, but unrealistic in terms of if a third party was going to do it, it's going to cost a lot more. So this is the risk profile that we're now dealing with when it comes to development finance.
Yeah, and I think I know I've seen this myself where someone's proposed a deal to us, and then we've sent it off. These are the sort of works that are going to be carried out, and the client sent us the costings. We've shared that with the lender, and then the lenders, QS and underwriters have reviewed it, and they said, that's too low. Basically, but we don't agree with those figures for the amount of work that's been done. And the builders push back, or the clients push back, who's the builder, and saying, well, no, we're doing this project ourselves. We're foregoing our profit as a builder in order to make the money on the deal itself. And this goes back to your point to going, the lender won't accept that. They will need to price the project in as if it were being done by any other contractor, because if things do go wrong, they're going to have to step in and get somebody else to finish the project if you're not around.
Yeah, definitely. So in the contract, in the loan agreement with the lender, they will have something called step-in rights. So that is the ability, as the name suggests, to step into the project if if these cost overruns are getting out of control and that sort of thing, then they might step in at that point. If you run out of money, you get injured or whatever, you can't finish the project. So they will come in, finish that. So that is something that they will build into the contract to have that. The other point that you mentioned around the build costs and the difference is BRICS. So RICS are the surveyors, the regulatory body for surveyors and valuers. BRICS, so they will have an index or a table that shows the average price per square foot or per square meter to build a project of that nature in the area, and they'll work off of that. So that's often the numbers that you're debating, and they are published numbers. They're kind of agreed. There's a lot of data that's gone into that will have things such as, obviously it will cost a lot more to build in central London than it will in Little Oneath in South Wales. So that will be factored into it. So if you are looking to see if your numbers make sense, you want to speak to a valuer, they will talk to you about this BRICS database. And if your numbers are miles out from that, then you're going to have a challenge.
Awesome. Okay, so we've talked now around the various ways this loan structure, the interest rates, why it's more expensive and the risks involved. Should we move on to sort of talk about the exit and exit planning and how you actually pay back this loan?
Yeah, definitely. The exit is equally as important as everything else. What is the plan really with this property? Are you looking to retain it? Are you looking to sell it? I guess are the two primary outcomes. There is something called developer exit, but that's more of an interim solution to get you to either sale or refinance. So this needs to be well thought out from the outset. Now, if you are building, so very often we will get scenarios where somebody's converting a commercial property into, say, 21 flats, yeah? And the exit will be, I'm going to sell them, or actually I'm going to keep it as a block, I'm going to rent it out and I'm going to have the income. a lot of consideration needs to be given to the market that you're going into with the product that you're building, or the product you're producing. You're ultimately taking a product to the market. Yes, it's housing. Yes, we need it. Yes, there's a shortage. However, we don't need every type of property in every location. Flats may not be appropriate in somewhere that is full of £2 million houses, and so on. So your exit strategy needs to consider what can the market actually withstand. Now, I've seen developments where they've been over 50, the high-rise blocks where they're for over 55 only, and they've had 200 units that are being built. The question is there a demand for 200 units for over 55 only accommodation in that area? And what is the phased process? What is your pricing process? Because you need to make sure, that's why house builders will, on second phase, increase the value and the purchase price and so on, because they want to preserve the first phase values. So on exit, so when you're putting your project together, just understand, what is the exit? Am I going to sell it? If I'm going to sell it, can the market tolerate what it is that I'm about to sell? Is it going to be student HMO in a professional location? Again, horses for courses. Am I building a right asset for the right product for what I want? And that goes for refinance. So just because you're going to get a mortgage on it and refinance it, when we get to value the property, there will be commentary in there around demand for that type of property in that area. And if there's no demand for it, because you've done something a little bit quirky maybe to create your value, you'll struggle to get a mortgage. So just have a very good thought, and a lot of detailed thought rather, around what am I building? How am I going to present that to the market? And is there actually demand for what I'm making?
I think on the really easy to understand side of things, something you just mentioned there is, are you going to build a student block of accommodation in a town where there's no university? And would you put £1 million house in the middle of a council estate, as an example? Now, those are two extreme examples, but I think it labours the point for me, people to understand is, who is my end user? What's the product? Because like you said, it's a product that you're producing there. Is there demand for that type of property in that type of location? I'm trying to understand the supply and demand then, and how, by introducing, if it's 21 bed flats onto the market for sale, when there's only 2 flats, on the market at the moment, and there's no real demand for them, you're going to flood the market, and that's going to just supply and demand. You're going to reduce the value of those properties. So it's making sure you've got different exits lined up. And obviously there's so many different options that you can do. But what we are seeing a lot at the moment of investors, the savvy investors, are doing demand-led developments. So they're trying to get their end user lined up, or their sales lined up, or their refinances lined up before, putting things on lease or whatever, before they even start the project. So they're going out to the market, seeing what the demand is for that location, and then trying to find someone to fill it, either by buying it or renting it before they even start the work. And that makes the development finance much easier, because you've already got an exit lined up, and it's having those multiple options. Yeah, point to note really as well, from a development lender's point of view, which will change as well depending on what you propose as your exit, is profit on cost. So if you imagine a scenario where, I'm assuming our listeners all understand that if they're looking to keep the property on a long-term basis. So let's say you're going to really simple. Let's go back to our original example of the property, buying it at 100, refurbing it 50, end value at 200,000. If you say you're going to keep that property and you want to refinance it, then you're going to refinance it probably to 75% loan to value. So if you're telling the lender that you're going to refinance it, they'll want to see that there's about 20 to 25% profit on your cost, so that you can refinance and there's enough room in there to pay back the loan that you've taken. And this isn't exact science, but just to give you a theory. But if you're saying that you're going to sell the property, then they will possibly reduce that to a profit on cost of 10 to 15%, because so you could sell that property for maybe 180 and still have enough money to pay them back. And so depending on what your number one exit is will impact massively how much they will lend to you as well. So that's something else to think about on whether those margins are in there. And this again is on bigger deals generally will have this impact, but it is something to be mindful of.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. And the other thing to consider as well is, and we see this increasingly, is where clients come to us and they have investors. So you may run some of your own cash in invariably, and then topping that up with some investor funds. Now, our primary goal when we're looking at these things is to repay the development loan. Yeah, that's the one that has to be repaid, etc. The one that causes the biggest problems. But many people forget that they also need to repay their investors. So that margin needs to be even better unless the investor is prepared to stay in for the longer term and so on and so forth. So don't forget that if you've got an investor loan and that is only for 12 months to top up what it is that you require, your exit needs to include that figure as well. Or you're going to have an awkward conversation with your investor that you can't give the money back because it's tied up in a deal that could take 5-10 years or whatever to actually materialize. So yeah, just remember all of those facilities that you've got.
And I think probably a pertinent point of where we are is something to bear in mind is shifts in the market as well in the economy. There's a known cycle in property around the 18-year property cycle. And the last crash we had was in 2006, 2007, 2008. And we are coming towards the end of this sort of 18-year cycle now. And there's always a crash coming. And history shows there's always a crash. And so it's just not if, it's when. And so it's understanding and being mindful of if you are going to get into development, and especially where there's planning involved. The planning process can take, in some instances, it's supposed to take 12 weeks, but it can take years. And if you're going to get into a project, you want to make sure that you've got multiple exits lined up and actually factor in potential, when you're going to finish the project, and factor in the potential of a market downturn, especially with where we are in the cycle now. That could be closer than people might think. So whilst things are, the market's okay at the moment, it's quite buoyant, you never know. And so it's just being mindful to that and not overlooking it, because that's easy to do. And history, like you said, does repeat itself.
Yeah, and I have this conversation a lot. And it used to be pre-COVID that people would stress test their projects, particularly on mortgages, because this is probably easier to understand to demonstrate the point is people would stress test their mortgages at, say, 6%. Yeah. Now, that's just an arbitrary number that's just been plucked out of the air because rates at the time were roughly 3%. So if it doubles, I'm okay. We can't predict the GDV or the end value. You can do your comparables and so on, as you say. We can't predict economic downturns accurately. We just know roughly what's going to happen. So what I would recommend that people do is it's a relatively simple exercise. So take your end value, okay? And what you want to understand is what level of value can I sustain before this becomes a problem. So if we're working on the basis you're going to refinance this at 75% loan to value, okay, all you would ultimately do is take your 200,000, divide that by 75%, and that will give you the 150 value, okay? Now, if you're saying then it's 210, then that's going to give you a 160 value, something along that lines, and so on and so forth. So all I would ultimately do is take your GDV, your end value, and just test. What if it comes in at 210? What is the loan I'm likely to get? If it comes in at 220, what's the loan I'm going to get? Conversely, if it comes in at 190, if it comes in at 180, if it comes in at 160, you'll have a number, and the loan amount will drop every time, or your profit margin will drop every time. There will be a number that doesn't work. Simple. If that number is one step away from your figure, your margin for error is really small. Yeah, and you are susceptible to all sorts of. The valuer might be having a bad day, because it is a professional opinion, and they might have got out of bed the wrong side. Economics, interest rates could change, as you say, crash or appetite for that type of asset, and so on and so forth. If, however, when you do that calculation, you're 7, 8, 9, 10 increments away, and you're going, well, even if even if at 150 it works, then you're going, well, that's a 25% change in value that you can tolerate, but there's a lot of room for error in that, so it still works. So that's what I would suggest people do, is not just go, oh, should we stress it by 10% either or? No, keep going until it fails. Understand how much of a margin for error exists in that project, and then you'll see it coming. You'll know that if cost overruns are coming in, if your budget has gone up by 10,000 and you've budgeted 50, right, okay, this still isn't the end of the world. I'm going to not make as much money, but then if I do another 5, it's going to start to cause me an issue, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you. So I think we've pretty much covered off, the exit strategies and everything else. So I think, we've covered quite a bit as much as we can on a high level basis. We're going to do a little bit of detail, and it's really difficult to go into a huge amount of details on a podcast like this without being able to show figures and things as well. So we're very mindful of that. So I guess then just kind of wrap up and just try and summarize some of these things into some sort of closing tips. I guess the first one being that it's important that you classify the project, and that's not necessarily for you to do as the client, but that's when you come to us, we will classify that internally, whether it's light refurb, heavy refurb, or full on development finance. So that's something that we would need to do. The assumptions on development finance are it's planning ready. So you already have the permission to do what you want. Then probably the next couple will probably come together then from what I see. So building a lender ready team. So making sure that you've got your professionals in place, and that accurate costs then comes as with this. So people like your quantity surveyor, your QS, your architect, your engineers, and project managers potentially, depending on how you're going to do it. But the costing is super important. Then in the importance of drawdowns and the drawdowns being cash flow lifelines. Ultimately, you're going to run out of money and it's going to get tight, and managing that cash flow and managing your drawdown effectively, like we discussed, depending on the size of the project, might be quite a quick process, but it might be quite a slow process. So making sure that you're on top of those. And then moving through to sort of really exit planning, is deal defining ultimately. And, it all goes back to start with the end in mind. I think it's Stephen Curry that said that. And it's super important. You can think about that as in many walks of life around starting with the end in mind. But it's super important where ultimately, what's the exit? And then work backwards, stress test. And then all of that will be done during your due diligence process before you even get planning. And obviously, if you're going to go through the planning process, you have to really think when you're doing the due diligence and the exit planning, how far away is that going to be? Because if it's going to take you a year to get planning and then do another year to do the development, you're trying to plan for 2 years' time, and that's a challenge. So be mindful of that. And then finally, I know you touched upon it briefly, a small plug, but there's lots of calculators that you can access via our website, primeproperty.finance, with various calculators in there. There's not a full-on development calculator in there because that's a difficult one to understand. But if people want to, I know you have a model that people can use, and if they come to you and chat through a deal, then you can put it through the model and discuss those with them. So doing a lot, understanding the finance costs will be a big part of the due diligence process, which needs to be done up front. And also we can discuss what the exit would look like as well on a refinance basis. Other than that, I think, it's a good wrap up there. Is there anything you wanted to close out with?
Yeah, so as with all things, as you say, start with the end in mind, working it backwards. That will help you get to your purchase price. So buying well is key to this, and factoring all the costs, etc. Again, just to re-emphasize around the calculators, there is an optimum purchase price calculator in there where it does exactly that. You plug in what margin you want to make, and it will tell you what the optimum purchase price is, and so on. So, yeah, just be informed. If it's not us, speak to somebody who's very familiar with development finance. There is a lot to think about, and you'll get guided through the process, especially if you've not done it before. There's many experienced developers that get lost in the world of development finance because it can be complicated. Our job is trying to make it as simple as possible. So don't be deterred. It's accessible. This is available to first-time developers as much as it is to large guys. So yeah, hopefully we've tried to make it sound as easy as possible. Fingers crossed. But yeah, don't be put off by it. We'll help. We'll help take you through the process. No worries at all.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, it's been really useful to chat through these with you. And I think ultimately there are deals to be done and there's money to be made, but it isn't easy. And it's navigating all of the different sections and key things that need to be ironed out early on. And it's all about risk mitigation. And if you can mitigate as much of that risk up front before you buy, that allows you to buy well. So yeah, go ahead, go and do deals, but just tread with caution and make sure you've covered as much off as you can and got insight from people who've been there and done it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for your time, Mark. Really appreciate it. Look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Yeah, all right, nice one. Cheers.
Thanks very much for listening to part 2. And hopefully you've had a load of value from both parts 1 and part 2 and you've listened all the way through. If you do have any questions, then please reach out to us at primeproperty.finance and we'd be more than happy to discuss any deals that you have, answer any questions. If you'd like to cover off any specific topics in the future or want to learn more about any topics that we haven't already covered, then please send us a question or drop us a DM and we'd be more than happy to cover that off in future episodes. And other than that, we'll see you on the next episode. Please like and subscribe and share with anyone who may be interested. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.